How's it going, everyone? So today we're going to be discussing something that actually comes up every single time a new generation starts, and really it's been somewhat recently that this has been a point of discussion since before things were very much different. And that is the question of, will we ever see a significant leap in graphical fidelity similar to what we saw going from the original PlayStation to the PS2 and even going from the PS2 to the PS3? Really, it was going from the PS3 to the PS4, where things, started they started being a little bit more subtle, and we didn't get to see that gigantic leap forward that we usually got with a new generation. That's when things kind of quieted down. And I think that personally, we're always going to reach a point where things just look good enough that there's only so much more that we can do to the image before we can make it somewhat, completely photorealistic. I mean, even when you look at games on the PS3 and 360, there are some games that I go back to and I'm like, wow, this looks fantastic. This doesn't look like it aged one bit. It's just the textures that are slightly lower resolution. And really, it's really good artistry that I think really helps some of these games and actually gives them life that extends well beyond their typical age and what you would expect a game of that generation to look. It's really about just great art and assets being used in video games and lighting as well, which a lot of times during the 7th generation, it was baked lighting. The artist would go in there and actually adjust it. It was not real time most of the time. So this is something that, obviously people are discussing coming from the PS4 to the PS5. Like, is the difference large enough? And I think that really we only have one major game that is kind of a next-gen showpiece, and that is Demon's Souls. Demon's Souls is the only big-budget AAA native app that's taking full advantage of the next-generation hardware. In that case, it's a PlayStation 5 exclusive. And I played Demon's Souls, and I can tell you that the game is jaw-droppingly gorgeous. And at times, it's just completely breathtaking. However, it's not on the level of photorealism. We aren't there yet. So I thought that this would be sort of a fun thing to sort of discuss, and I think that when we look at games like during the 7th generation, it was very much about the static image of it, right? We had games running at 720p, sometimes even slightly below 720p. There was a handful of 1080p games, mostly on the PS3, since that was really the only native 1080p console that we had during that generation, but those titles were very few and far between, right? And games had a very static look to them. We were all used to sort of aliasing, so we were used to having this rough edges on our video games back then. And, but things looked clear enough. Really, the PS3 and the 360 were all about high definition, right? That was like the big point of contention there when those consoles launched. It's high definition gaming, HD, 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 which at the time, we considered 720p to be HD, 1080p being full HD. It's a bit different now, actually. YouTube has actually gotten rid of the HD icon next to the 720p option on videos, which is a bit interesting. But, that's what it was to us technically during that time. And I think that we got a very comparable experience at the start of the PlayStation 4 and at the start of the Xbox One, because games looked better. They were running at higher resolution, right? But we were still using the same techniques like MSAA for anti-aliasing, or FXAA. We really saw during the previous generation really was towards the middle point where games were sort of being made, where we started getting into reconstruction and post-processing and temporal injection and all this kind of cool stuff. And so now when a game comes out, aliasing isn't really an issue anymore. Now it comes in the form of clarity. A high resolution, you get a very clear image, or if it's a very low resolution, it looks blurry. It doesn't necessarily look jaggy anymore. It looks very blurry. And we got the PlayStation 4 Pro, we got the Xbox One X, which helped us, reach sort of that 4K goal of really what those consoles should have been when they launched. But even then, we a lot of those consoles needed to use reconstruction in order to get there. And so the image, when it comes to actually creating a video game and talking about resolution and stuff, most of the time we're playing games with dynamic resolution or some form of upscaling or some trickery in order to get to a 4K presentation, since 4K rendering is incredibly expensive, and we could sort of fake it and it looks comparable to the point where, unless you're sitting up there with a magnifying glass, you can tell the difference. Now, I always look at NVIDIA's DLSS and what they're doing on PC. That is some of the most incredible technology, I think, of recent years, just because of how much it actually does to the video game presentation. You can get the super high frame rates, but you can do it without having to sacrifice the clarity of the resolution. And in some cases, in NVIDIA DLSS, it'll actually resolve more detail than the native presentation. I think it's really interesting when Digital Foundry does their sort of reviews on games and stuff. They've done a lot of tests where you can zoom up to like 200% on the character's face and you can see actual more detail on the upscaled fake DLSS image versus the native presentation in 4K. I think it's just incredible to see that AI can really solve a lot of issues with us when it comes to the image presentation, and we're seeing that a lot being used on the consoles as well. You guys are seeing Watch Dogs Legion right now. This game runs at a dynamic resolution. Sometimes it hits native 4K, sometimes it goes below that. This game looks incredibly clean though. I could not tell you when the resolution drops. I just know that it does at points, but I couldn't tell you when because it's so subtle and it looks sharp all the time. And we have, again, those temporal anti-aliasing filters going in there to help clear up any of the aliasing or artifacts that you may get whenever the resolution drops. So it's a very, very interesting thing. I always said that each generation has like a theme. And going with the PlayStation 3 and the 360, the theme was high definition, right? That was like the big points. I think with the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, the big thing for me was refinement. It was about, let's make a very filmic presentation with games. Let's get rid of aliasing. It doesn't look night and day different to what maybe you'd see on the PS3 and 360, but we can clean up the image a lot. We can stabilize the image a lot. We've actually got a lot more stable frame rates in a lot of games this past generation than we ever had during the 360 and PS3 games. I mean, when you go back to play some of those games, and I personally have, Grand Theft Auto 5 was chugging along. It had performance comparable to Cyberpunk 2077 today. But, back then it was like, we accepted that. So our standards have changed. We changed the way that we sort of produce the image right now in games. And graphical fidelity, the big thing this generation is ray tracing, right? It's all about ray tracing. And I wonder if that's going to be the theme this generation. Is it more just about ray traced reflections and ray traced lighting, ray traced shadows? What you're seeing in Watch Dogs Legion right here is ray traced reflections. The resolution of these ray traced reflections is a quarter of the game's native resolution. So when the game runs at 4K, it's 1080p, but when the game scales below 4K, which it does, a little bit, the resolutions will drop under 1080p for those reflections. And what I realized is when playing Watch Dogs Legion, the reflections, although it's really cool to have, a very nice realistic and, actual real-time reflection that isn't using screen space, it's actually there. It adds a lot to the image, yes, but the resolution of these reflections is actually quite low, and so I noticed a lot of pixel breakup, a lot of noise and filtering going on in the reflections, and sometimes, honestly, I would say a lot of times on cars, it looked very distracting, like very noisy. And so I don't think Watch Dogs necessarily had the best implementation of it, but, I played Spider-Man Miles Morales, which is another game that has, ray trace reflections, and the resolution of those were excellent. You got shadows in those reflections as well. They did a really good job with the presentation of that game. So it's going to be interesting to see, really the end of what the PS5 and the Series X, how different games will look. It's always the question of when we get to photorealism, what's next after that? Like, how much more can we put into games before we sit there and say, what, this is good enough? Because we're going to reach a point, right? We're going to reach a point where photorealism, hyperrealism, everything is possible. And it will be as if you're just watching an actual film with real people. It's so lifelike. But what do we aspire to do after that? What's the next step? I personally, I think games look good enough. I like to bring up my favorite, one of my favorite games of all time, Mirror's Edge. But if you've watched the original Mirror's Edge running in native 4K, that's an example of great art in video games. That game is always going to look good, and I did a full 4K 60 FPS playthrough of that game here on YouTube, and I mean, just looking at the quality of the game, the actual, resolution and everything like that, it looks incredible. And that's just due to the art direction of that game. There's a lot of games that do look extremely good still, even with their lower resolutions. So, I think that, when it comes to graphical fidelity, it's always exciting to talk about. I always appreciate it when developers go in there and spend a lot of time, optimizing the hardware and really trying to push what they can do with the actual consoles and stuff like that. I will always appreciate a beautiful presentation in games. But I've realized that, for me, what I really appreciate even more so is just outstanding art design, because, a game can look photorealistic, but to make it look timeless, right? To actually, to have a game that's like 15, 20 years old and still look good enough to the point where you're actually impressed, I mean, that to me is a much more valuable experience than just simply saying, oh, we can do photorealism now, But it's interesting. I'm really excited to see where this generation takes us in terms of graphical fidelity. I think that we started off this generation pretty decently. The consoles are very powerful. I'm very happy with the performance side. Playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla, basically the maxed out PC experience, but at 60 FPS was incredible. And even Watch Dogs Legion here, it's a 30 frames per second game, yes, but you're getting ray trace reflections, and I didn't mind a 30 FPS mode in this game. It was incredibly stable. It did not dip once. And I played Demon's Souls, and Demon's Souls doesn't have any ray tracing, but again, it looks like that's a game taking full advantage of the PlayStation 5, and that's a 60 FPS experience, unwavering. It doesn't dip. It's absolutely perfect. So, and this weekend I'm going to be playing Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, so I'm going to see how that game looks with its ray trace reflections and stuff. You can have 120 frames per second in that game. So it's cool to have options. I'm really excited with where we are right now. I think that this generation has a lot of potential. I'm much more excited about where gaming is going now than I was at the start of the PS4 and Xbox One. Again, it looks like creativity is sort of coming back with this generation, even the stuff that's coming out, some really cool looking games and things like that, and even old franchises that are returning that I absolutely loved. They're starting to give another chance to. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. But yeah, let me know. Do you think that we're ever gonna, see a large graphical leap, sort of like we went from going from the PS2 to the PS3, or going from the original PlayStation to the PS2? Are we going to see something that's so significant like that? Or do you think that it's going to be more small incremental things because games already look so good, which they do? You're looking at Watch Dogs Legion right now on screen. This game looks good. I don't think anyone's going to say this game doesn't look good. It looks great, So it's a bit interesting. Interested to hear what you guys think. And yeah, we'll talk later. Thank you.